I've always considered myself a slow, unobservant person, yet I still discovered traces of Zhao Liang's infidelity. I had always enjoyed taking care of everything for our household, despite the fact that we had a housekeeper who helped organize our clothes and belongings. I liked doing it myself, classifying, tidying things up just the way I preferred that day. As usual, I placed Zhao Liang's clothes in the laundry basket, but when I reached into his jacket pocket, I found a long, light brown curly hair. My hair had always been straight and black, so that strand of hair clearly wasn't mine. I picked it up, stared at it for a moment, and thought it must have belonged to someone else, maybe a friend or client of his. I didn't think too much about it. I just found the hair color quite pretty and briefly wondered if I should dye my hair the same. But Zhao Liang had always told me how much he loved my straight black hair, how obedient and sweet it looked. So I quickly dismissed the idea of changing it. In hindsight, that was the first time I came so close to uncovering the ugly truth. What really woke me up to the abnormality was when someone else mentioned it to me. Tran Quan, one of Zhao Liang's closest friends, had taken him home after a night out drinking because our driver, Mr. TRNH, was away visiting family. Zhao Liang was completely drunk, barely coherent. After making sure he was settled, I walked Tran Quan to the door. He was polite as always, but before leaving, he said something I didn't understand at the time. He said, "Sister-in-law, do you really think there's such a thing as a perfect man like Zhao Liang?" I thought he was just drunk and that his words were a bit confused, but now, when I think back, it seems he was trying to tell me something and then stopped himself. His expression had been unusually serious, almost grave. I hated myself for being so laughably naive. Everyone around me seemed to know the truth except for me. I was blissfully unaware, still lost in the beautiful dream Zhao Liang had woven for me from that moment on. I started noticing more and more odd signs at first. I reassured myself that maybe it was just the stress of finishing my graduate degree, that my imagination was running wild. But things quickly spiraled out of control. I began to smell a strange perfume on Zhao Liang's shirts. I found 2 expired movie tickets in his wallet. They were for a romantic film that had been quite popular, and in the trash folder of his computer's email, I stumbled upon a message from a foreign hotel with the headline "Premier Couples Suite." I trusted Zhao Liang not without reason. He was exceptionally good at maintaining his facade. So upright and clean, he never hid his phone messages from me, and he would even show them to me if I asked. His office, his computer, they were all open to me one day. I had an urgent paper to submit, but my laptop had broken down. I had no choice but to use his at the time. He was in the kitchen making my favorite ginger braised chicken. I called down from the stairs. "Zhao Liang, can I use your laptop to send an email to my professor?" He replied without hesitation. "Of course, love. You don't need to ask." We'd been married for 6 years, together for 9, and he still called me with such warmth, making my heart melt like honey. Even though he always let me use his personal things, I made it a rule to inform him beforehand. That was my principle in marriage, giving each other space. I blew him a kiss and thanked him. He playfully caught it, pressed it to his lips, and beamed at me. He had never grown tired of indulging in my childish antics. That's why I always felt like my life was filled with roses and happiness. I quickly sent my email, but as I closed the screen, I noticed the trash icon on his desktop had a beside it. Maybe it was my obsessive-compulsive tendencies, or maybe I'd momentarily forgotten my marital principles. But I clicked on it, intending to clean up his emails. My cat bumped into my hand, causing the email to open. I scooped up the cat to stop her from wreaking havoc, but my eyes accidentally skimmed over the word hotel. At that moment, perhaps it was my woman's intuition kicking in. My mind immediately flashed warnings, and before I knew it, I was reading the entire email. It was just a typical follow-up, thanking the recipient for their stay and expressing hope for a future visit. But there, in bold, were the words that pierced me like a knife: Premier Couples Suite. In that instant, my mind went blank, but somehow I managed to memorize the hotel's phone number. My body went cold, my heart pounding like it was about to burst from my chest. Was I jumping to conclusions? Could the hotel have sent the email by mistake? Or maybe Zhao Liang had booked the room for someone else? But deep down, I knew I was just running away from the truth that night. As I looked at Zhao Liang's face, he suddenly seemed like a stranger. Had I misunderstood? Or was this perfect man truly that good at acting? I couldn't control my expression. I made an excuse, saying there was a problem with my data and that I needed to return to the university to sort it out. Zhao Liang, seeing my anxiety, didn't stop me and simply reminded me to come back soon. I booked a room at a nearby hotel. I felt like I needed space and time. Otherwise, I might scream, destroy everything, or even hurt myself. I called the foreign hotel, speaking in English, telling them I was Zhao Liang's wife and that I'd received their email. I casually said I planned to book the same suite for a week next month. The person on the other end, probably the concierge, responded warmly and familiarly. Congratulations on becoming a mother. You were amazing. How's your recovery coming along? I was stunned into silence. What was this person talking about? Becoming a mother? Recovery? What were they referring to? Zhao Liang and I didn't have children. I instinctively replied, it's going better. The person on the other end continued, last time you visited, it was so difficult for you to move around. Being in the late stages of pregnancy, you almost slipped in the bathroom, and Mr. Zhao was so worried. We've since made improvements to the bathroom design to ensure you have a better experience next time. After hanging up, my mind buzzed with disbelief. Could this dramatic storyline actually be happening to me? I collapsed onto the bed, my head spinning at that moment. Zhao Liang called. I didn't answer but sent him a WeChat message instead. Too much data to go through. I won't be coming home tonight. I'm staying at a hotel near the university. Zhao Liang, love. Let me come to you. It's late, and I'm worried about your safety. Me, no need. I'll send you my location soon. Get some rest. Zhao Liang, all right. Call me if you need anything. Make sure you get some sleep too. Love. As I looked at our chat on my phone, a wave of nausea washed over me. My husband, the man I'd loved for 9 years, had cheated on me. Not only that, but he had another woman pregnant with his child, and in the eyes of others, that woman was considered his wife. So, what did that make me? This was the most dramatic plot twist I'd ever experienced. In that moment, Zhao Liang became a complete stranger to me when he wasn't busy. He'd come home early to cook my favorite meals. I'd always believed he did it because he loved me and because I knew how to keep our marriage happy. I used to joke with him that I'd hit the jackpot, finding such a perfect life partner from the moment we fell in love. Through marriage, and all these years together, 9 in total, our relationship had always been stable and sweet. But now I wondered, is there really such a thing as a perfect partner? Do you really think there's a man as perfect as Zhao Liang? I suddenly recalled Tran Quan's question. It turned out that all the so-called perfection and attentiveness were just part of the act. It all made sense now. I had never imagined Zhao Liang capable of doing such things. Even now, I still hoped that everything was a misunderstanding, that there would be some miraculous reversal, but reality hit me hard. Without mercy. Before we continue, I want to tell you about my past with Zhao Liang. We met during our university years, more specifically at the house of one of my friends, Dip Kai Lin. She had a younger brother still in middle school, and her family had hired a tutor, a graduate student from the nearby university. That day, Kai Lin invited me over for dinner, and it was the first time I met Zhao Liang. Zhao Liang was tall and a bit thin. Later, I learned that his family struggled financially, and since starting college, he had taken on several jobs. The combination of exhaustion and irregular meals had left him somewhat undernourished. But despite that, he was incredibly handsome. His facial features were sharp, his expression sincere and gentle, and the small mole on the tip of his nose gave him a youthful charm. I fell in love with him at first sight. Later, when we started dating, he confessed to me that he had felt the same. We both fell in love at first sight after we graduated. We got married. To be honest, I hadn't planned to marry so early, but my parents' relationship had been deteriorating for a long time. My mother suspected my father of having an affair. My father, on the other hand, thought my mother was overreacting. They fought constantly, sometimes even physically, and things only got worse between them. I despised that toxic family environment. By the time I graduated, my parents had divorced, and my father left without a word. From then on, my mother projected all her marital bitterness onto me. She never looked at me with any kindness no matter what I did. She always found an excuse to scold me. At that time, Zhao Liang was my only support after we graduated. Zhao Liang wanted to build his career in Shenzhen. He asked me to go with him, And so he proposed. My mother strongly disapproved. Not only because she thought I was too young to marry, but also because she didn't want me to marry Zhao Liang. Zhao Liang's family was poor, and his parents still lived in the countryside. They couldn't afford to provide a dowry or buy us a house, let alone throw a wedding. But Zhao Liang gave me all the savings he had accumulated during his university years, a total of 50 million at that moment. I thought Zhao Liang was truly a good man. He was the kind of person who, if he had 10 million, would give me 9 and use the last million to buy me an ice cream. I believed in his love for me wholeheartedly and trusted every promise he made. Of course, I wasn't blindly in love with a bad man. I valued not just his character but also his drive. I believed Zhao Liang would succeed. Time proved that my instincts were right. 5 years after we got married, he successfully built his company, but that's a story for later. Let's go back to the beginning when Zhao Liang first met my mother. She threw things at him. We had a terrible argument. I tried to reason with her, but she lashed out with hurtful words, claiming I was bewitched by a man, that I was useless, and that I would follow in her doomed footsteps. I really thought my mother had lost her mind to escape that stifling environment. I did something bold. I secretly took the family registration book and quietly registered my marriage with Zhao Liang. Zhao Liang was moved to tears. It was the first time I had ever seen him cry. I laughed and wiped his tears. Teasing. Real men don't cry. He hugged me tightly and promised, I won't let you regret this choice, my love. After our wedding, we only bought a simple pair of rings that cost a few million, and I returned the rest of the money to him to invest in his startup. We rented a tiny studio, barely 60 square meters, and it was just the two of us. He coded and sought out partners, while I helped with securing investments. We lived and worked out of that tiny space despite the exhaustion. Zhao Liang always took care of me. He handled the cooking and cleaning, never letting me take on too much. But I wanted to help, so I took on some of the business calls, tried to secure more funding, and managed the company's operations to ease his burden. The toughest time came in our second year of marriage, when our newly launched business was hit by a major setback. A large company pulled out of a deal, leaving us with a gaping hole in our finances. We faced hundreds of millions in debt and couldn't pay our employees. We tried everything, but the gap was too big to fill. A bank loan covered only a small portion, and our attempts to borrow money from friends barely scratched the surface. It felt like we had hit a dead end during that period. Zhao Liang was in a terrible state. He stopped eating, but no matter what, he never snapped at me. He always spoke to me gently, patiently. Sometimes I wished he would just vent his frustration instead of bottling it all up inside. The company was on the brink of bankruptcy. We couldn't even pay off our debts. It was at that moment that Zhao Liang told me he wanted a divorce. I knew he didn't want to drag me down with him, but I was furious. How could he say those words so easily? We argued. Or rather, I yelled at him while he stayed silent, never fighting back. It was the first time we had ever had a conflict. In the end, I told him just one thing: I will never divorce you. Once I had calmed down, I began to think of ways to fix the situation. I didn't want all of his hard work to go to waste, and I certainly didn't want it to destroy our relationship in the end. I came up with the only solution I could think of: asking my parents for help. When my mother found out I had secretly gotten married, she declared she was cutting all ties with me and called me an ungrateful wretch. In my anger, I hadn't spoken to her for over a year. I was too afraid to call her, worried she would hang up on me. So, I made the decision to go back to Beijing myself. To my surprise, my mother was unusually calm. Oh, you remember the way back, do you? I thought you didn't need this family anymore, or your mother for that matter. I had to swallow my pride and bow my head. I told her about the company's situation, hoping she could lend me some money. Deep down, I also hoped she would allow me to use the family home as collateral for a loan, which would help us fill the financial hole. Though my mother wasn't as fiery as she once was, she still scolded me relentlessly. She still didn't like Zhao Liang, and I silently let her vent her anger. She refused to mention lending any money. I thought there would be no outcome this time, but just as I was about to leave, she relented. She handed me a bank card. There's only about 170 million in here. It won't be enough to cover everything, but it should help ease the crisis. You can take the house deed and use it as collateral. You're grown now. I can't control you anymore. If you're willing to stand against your own mother for a man, I won't hold it against you. If anyone is to blame, blame your father and me for neglecting you while we fought. She was still stern, But behind her words was a deep love. She sighed softly before adding, "There's only one thing I'll say, we women can't rely on men. You can't trust anyone but yourself." I was grateful for her help. But I couldn't understand how she had come up with such a large amount of money. It wasn't until later that I found out she had called my father that very night. He had already moved in with another woman. I don't know what she said to him, but she managed to borrow over 50 million from him. She also sold a gold bracelet and some jewelry that my grandmother had given her to gather the rest with the money in hand. I sat on the flight back to Shenzhen, crying as though my heart would break at that moment. I felt a twinge of regret for how I had treated my mother, but I still believed in Zhao Liang and the choice I had made. I promised myself I would pay my mother back tenfold and repair the rift between us. That money was our lifeline, and it saved the company from ruin. Zhao Liang was incredibly grateful. Even though we were husband and wife, he never took anything I did for granted. He always appreciated me, and that was one of the key reasons I stood by my decision. Our life gradually improved. The company moved from our tiny studio to a high-rise office in the central business district. With our staff growing from 3 or 5 people to 40, Zhao Liang knew I had always wanted to pursue a master's degree, but I had put that dream on hold to help him. So, in our 4th year of marriage, I stepped back from running the company and became a full-time wife to focus on my studies. In the 5th year, I passed the entrance exam for a university in Shenzhen and began studying journalism. Something I had always been passionate about. I paid back the money my mother had lent us and even gave her another bank card as a token of my gratitude. My mother and I slowly reconnected. Though she still treated Zhao Liang coldly, I wasn't sure if it was out of habit or if she just didn't want to change her opinion of him. Those 2 years were the happiest of my life. I had a loving, loyal husband by my side. And though my mother was tough on the outside, she had a soft heart. Our life was peaceful and sweet until everything fell apart for the next 2 days. I didn't go home, nor did I call Zhao Liang. I hoped he would notice the change in me and confess, so we could part peacefully. But I was also terrified of actually breaking up, of hearing the words I didn't want to hear, making everything uglier than it already was. I didn't know what to do. On one hand, I had the stress of graduating, and on the other, I had the weight of Zhao Liang's betrayal. My mother's words had finally come true. I had never imagined there would come a day when I would have to leave him. But after everything that had happened, staying quiet was no longer an option. I couldn't accept a man who had cheated on me. The words disgusting and repulsive were all that came to mind. The 9 years of love between us. How could I believe that everything had been a lie? An act? My life felt shattered by this. All my blind trust, all the sacrifices I made for our relationship, seemed like a joke those days. I couldn't sleep. My eyes ached. But no tears would come. Even though I wasn't the strongest or most decisive person, I wasn't a coward either. I consulted a lawyer. The best course of action was to gather evidence of his infidelity and secure my own interests. But as I got closer to the truth, the mounting evidence suffocated me. Who was Zhao Liang? Really? I could no longer see through him. The lawyer suggested I check the family assets. I knew exactly where everything was. Zhao Liang had never hidden anything from me besides the company. We had 3 properties. A 3-story villa where we lived, a large apartment, and a 3-bedroom unit that Zhao Liang had bought for my mother, but she refused to accept it. We also owned 2 cars in the past. I hadn't paid much attention to these things. Zhao Liang had always managed it all. If I hadn't checked, I would have never known all these assets, the result of our joint efforts, were in my name. Except for the Bentley I couldn't understand. Typically, when a husband cheats, the first thing he does is transfer assets, wanting to avoid sharing them with his wife. Especially in our case, where there were no children involved. I couldn't grasp what Zhao Liang was thinking. Did he believe he had done everything so perfectly that I would never find out? Or did he think it wasn't necessary yet? Even at this point, I started doubting myself, wondering if I had misunderstood. Could there be a twist to all of this? Everything was so confusing, and I felt even more lost. What was Zhao Liang really planning? After 2 days of investigating, I gathered some clues. At least now, when I saw Zhao Liang again, I could pretend everything was normal. That Friday, I returned home. Zhao Liang had prepared dinner. Thinking I had been busy at school with my thesis, he tenderly fussed over me, telling me how hard I was working and urging me to wash my hands before eating. My nose tingled, and tears threatened to fall in that moment. I wished I had never discovered the truth. Could we still be that perfect couple? That ideal pair of lovers. As we sat down to dinner, Zhao Liang served me food as if nothing was wrong. I wanted to shatter everything, to demand why he had done this to me. But I hesitated. Clinging to the fragile piece, Zhao Liang suddenly put down his chopsticks, staring at me with concern. Love, why are you crying? Did something happen at school? Are you feeling overwhelmed? He gently stroked my cheek and pulled me into his arms. I wished time would stop right there. That we could remain the couple everyone envied, but I couldn't ignore the truth. I couldn't betray myself at that moment. All I could do was lie and say that I'd been feeling anxious lately. Zhao Liang was so worried for me. He said he'd stay home with me all weekend, and we could go on a little trip to relax. I smiled and agreed. I loved going to amusement parks. Maybe it was because, when I was little, my parents were always too busy to take me, and they never cared about whether I was having fun or not. Zhao Liang knew how much I enjoyed it and was always willing to indulge these small wishes of mine over the years. We had visited amusement parks in several cities, and every year, we made a point to go to Disneyland. I never got tired of it. That weekend, Zhao Liang took me to an amusement park. After finishing some work, he rode the roller coasters with me, the pirate ships, even the carousel. Without a hint of embarrassment, before I could even say I was thirsty, he had already bought me a drink. Before I felt tired, he had found us a place to rest. His thoughtfulness, as always, made me almost forget everything that had happened in this atmosphere. I didn't want to dwell on any troubles. After a while, I needed to use the restroom, and Zhao Liang waited nearby when I came out. He was no longer sitting in his spot. I looked around and saw him standing under a tree, his back to the crowd, speaking on the phone. I quietly approached, planning to surprise him, but before I got too close, I overheard him say, "Love, I'm busy with work today. I'll be home late, so please take care of our child. Has the baby been good? Not giving you too much trouble, right?" I stepped back in that moment. My blood boiled. I wanted to grab the phone from his hand and slap him across the face, but I couldn't do anything. Zhao Liang turned and saw me, quickly putting on his serious work face. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but he walked over to me. I couldn't pretend to be the loving wife any longer. My face remained cold and distant. Zhao Liang looked a bit nervous, speaking continuously, but none of his words reached me. He tried to take my hand, but I pulled away. I didn't want him to touch me. "I'm tired. Let's go home." On the way back, I said nothing. Neither did Zhao Liang. I knew he probably realized that his secret was out, but he didn't say a word. Inside me, a storm raged, while he remained as calm as ever. How good an actor was he? Once again, I felt like I didn't know him at all. Back at home, there was no interaction between us, but Zhao Liang still cooked for me, still showed his care. Even though I refused to look at him, I hoped he would confess, but he showed no sign of it. He carried on as if nothing had happened, living out our daily routine as though everything were normal. Was he waiting for me to confront him, forcing me to make the decision? I didn't know how long he intended to keep up the act, but I couldn't play along any longer. If this continued, I would lose my mind. I spent an entire week at home, mostly in my room, letting my mind wander. That was until I got a call from Lam Yin, inviting me out for a walk. She had texted me numerous times before, but I hadn't responded. She had even called, but I hadn't picked up. I couldn't keep doing this anymore. Even if a divorce or a big confrontation was inevitable, I shouldn't keep punishing myself. I wasn't the one at fault. Why was I turning myself into this? I quickly got ready, not bothering with makeup. I just slipped on a mask and hat before heading out. As I drove out of the parking lot, a ray of sunlight hit my face, making me momentarily dizzy. It had been so long since I'd been outside. I drove slowly, trying not to think about Zhao Liang's affair, keeping my mind from drifting into dangerous territory. I reminded myself to be strong. As a woman in the 21st century, I needed to have the courage to face failure head-on. When I arrived at the mall where we had agreed to meet, I parked and prepared to take the elevator up. That's when I spotted a familiar figure on the street corner. It was Zhao Liang. He was holding a small child in his arms, occasionally bending down to kiss the baby's cheek. Beside him was a young woman, smiling as she pushed the stroller. My mind buzzed, as if Zhao Liang's image had burned into my consciousness. He had long since stopped caring, hadn't he? His life was perfect now. Why would he have any worries? I took out my phone and snapped a few photos, quietly following them. My thoughts were in a whirlwind, but I knew this wasn't the time for confrontation. If I approached them now, I'd just be a discarded woman. An unwelcome sight. I wanted to see what kind of man Zhao Liang truly was. After 9 years together, I still hadn't fully understood him, but I would make him pay for this. I contacted Lam Yin, quickly swapping cars with her. She looked shocked, but I didn't have time to explain. I trailed them for the rest of the day, eventually learning the young woman's address. Zhao Liang had certainly lived up to his reputation as a good man. He had set her up in a villa with 2 live-in maids. How thoughtful and meticulous of him. I reached out to a private investigator I had found online, a young but highly rated professional named Shoro Jie. I gave him the address and photos, asking him to follow them and gather solid evidence of Zhao Liang's infidelity. Shoro Jie worked quickly. Within a week, he sent me a paternity test, a stack of photos, and the young woman's basic information. The 99.9% certainty that Zhao Liang was the father chilled me to the bone. The sight of their happy little family stung my eyes. Staring at the evidence, whatever love or hope I had left for Zhao Liang vanished. I was forced to accept that I had fallen for the wrong person. Zhao Liang was nothing more than a despicable man. The only interesting part was the information about the young woman. She came from a clean background, no debt-ridden parents or terminally ill relatives, leaving me baffled. Was she in it for the money? Love? I couldn't understand why she had chosen to destroy someone else's family. Looking at her photo again, something struck me. She bore a slight resemblance to me. Could it be? Was Zhao Liang insane? Did he have a strange obsession with collecting women who looked alike? I had Shoro Jie continue following Zhao Liang, as it was time for me to confront the woman who had wrecked my family. According to Xiao Jie's investigation, the woman's name was Su Wen. She was 24 years old, an architecture major with excellent grades, and had just signed with a prestigious company right after graduation. Weren't young women nowadays supposed to prioritize enjoying life over getting married and having children early? Clearly, Su Wen wasn't your typical domestic goddess either. The last time I saw her at the mall, she was wearing ripped jeans and rebellious makeup, hardly the image of a mother. I disguised myself as a resident of the area, jogging around her neighborhood while thinking of how to approach her. Coincidentally, Su Wen came out for a stroll with her baby in tow. The nanny spent a long time giving her instructions. After running 2 laps, I saw her sitting on a bench in the garden, playing with the baby. I was about to pretend to be a neighbor and strike up a conversation, but out of nowhere, a dog ran by. Trying to avoid it, I took a big step, twisted my ankle, and fell to the ground. How unlucky. Following a mistress and ending up injuring myself. What a waste. Just as I was cursing my luck, Su Wen came over to help me up. Are you okay, sis? Do you need me to take you to the hospital? Right into the trap. Su Wen asked the nanny to take the baby home, then told me to wait while she got her car to drive me to the hospital. She pulled up on a high-performance motorcycle. I didn't know the brand, but from the sleek design, I could tell it was expensive. Su Wen sped off like the wind, and I clung tightly to her waist, my heart racing as if it were about to leap out of my chest. The adrenaline was unreal. Who would have thought that I'd be riding on the back of my husband's mistress's motorcycle, holding her by the waist? Even TV dramas wouldn't dare write this. Su Wen was genuinely kind. She helped me register at the hospital, find a doctor, and pick up my medication. Afterward, she even insisted on driving me home. That's when I remembered that I had lied about living in her neighborhood. I couldn't let her find out, so I told her I lived alone and wasn't ready to go home just yet. With Lam Yin on vacation overseas, I had no one else to turn to. Reluctantly, I called Shoro Jie. Shoro Jie, the top-rated and priciest investigator, proved to be as sharp and clever as ever. He helped me maintain my cover flawlessly. Su Wen, ever the responsible one, revved up her bike and took me to Xiao Jie's place, even helping me inside. Shoro Jie stood at the door, arms crossed, silently watching as I awkwardly played along. Hey, kid, why didn't you come help your sis? After Su Wen left, I read her messages on WeChat, feeling a mix of emotions. Sis Fei Fei, if you ever need help, just let me know. At first, I considered going home, even though it meant facing Zhao Liang. After all, the housekeeper would take care of me. But to my surprise, Shoro Jie was quite understanding. Perhaps he sympathized with my situation, so he invited me to stay in his guest room for a while. Though, honestly, I suspected it was because I had paid him too much during my recovery. Shoro Jie took excellent care of me, despite his youth. He was thoughtful. Handling everything from household chores to cooking. Every cent I paid him was worth it. This unexpected turn of events had thrown me off balance. Not only had I confronted the mistress head-on, but I had also befriended her on WeChat, and we even called each other sister. I realized Sue Wen was nothing like her outward appearance. During the 2 days I was recuperating, she messaged me occasionally, genuinely concerned, and seemed quite friendly. She confided that she didn't have many friends in the city. Her husband was always busy, leaving her with little companionship. She even complained that if she had known this would happen, she would have just had the baby without getting married. Her rebellious streak shocked me, but it also made me realize she might be a victim too. She mentioned marriage, which confirmed that there had been some sort of formal arrangement. Zhao Liang couldn't be foolish enough to commit bigamy if my marriage certificate with him was real. Then Sue Wen's had to be fake. How had Zhao Liang deceived her? I needed to get closer to Sue Wen to find out, to thank Sue Wen for her help. I decided to invite her out for dinner. It was also a chance to gauge her feelings toward Zhao Liang. I still couldn't believe that such a free-spirited woman would willingly wreck another family. We met at a Chongqing hotpot restaurant. She was dressed as usual, stylishly sexy. Her light brown curls tied high. We chatted about all sorts of things: food, hobbies, studies, work, and to my surprise, we got along incredibly well. If it hadn't been for this situation, we could have become great friends. I steered the conversation toward children and the father of her child. Sue Wen admitted that marriage hadn't been part of her original plan. She and Zhao Liang had met through work. As their companies collaborated, it was love at first sight, but Sue Wen was the one who had pursued him, and Zhao Liang hadn't resisted. They quickly became a couple. Though Sue Wen had no intention of marrying, she could fall in love, but the thought of marriage scared her. In fact, Sue Wen said her original plan had been to become a single mother by the time she turned 30. However, when she unexpectedly got pregnant, she decided to keep the baby. She still didn't want to get married, but due to family pressure, they agreed to create a fake marriage certificate. As she told me this, she even praised Zhao Liang. She said he was incredibly thoughtful, so understanding of her needs, and had even come up with the idea of a fake marriage. I wanted to pour cold water over her delusions, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Zhao Liang, that scumbag, how could she call him thoughtful? He was obviously plotting something for himself. The feudal era had long since passed, yet he was living like a king, basking in the secret happiness of having his cake and eating it too. I no longer had any feelings for Zhao Liang. All I wanted was to cut ties with him as quickly as possible, but I didn't know how to break the news to Sue Wen. After all, she was a victim too. Recently, Zhao Liang had continued playing the role of a good husband, acting out his performance alone. There was no chance he would confess on his own. When I returned home, Zhao Liang was in his study. I decided it was time to lay everything out on the table. Calmly, I told him, "Zhao Liang, stop pretending. I know you've been cheating. Let's get a divorce. We can work out the details of the process later." At first, Zhao Liang tried to fake his innocence, claiming it had just been a moment of weakness, that he knew he was wrong, and that he had already cut things off with the other woman. He pulled me into a seat, reminiscing about the days we built the company together, saying how much he loved and cherished me. It was laughable. If I hadn't met Sue Wen, if I hadn't seen photos of their perfect little family, maybe I would have softened. Maybe I would have believed him. But if it hadn't been Sue Wen, it would have been someone else. He had deceived me for 2 years, and he could have kept fooling me even longer. That's what I got for trusting him so much. I threw the photos Shou Jie had given me in front of him. Zhao Liang finally realized I knew everything. He looked at me deeply. "Yuan Fei, even so, I still love you. I've always loved you. Can't you feel it? We've been together for so many years. Do you think she could ever compare to you?" "Yes. She gave birth to my child. But didn't you say you didn't want kids yet? You said you were scared of the pain. I didn't want you to suffer. You could easily pretend nothing happened. If you bring it up, all you'll do is make us both miserable. What will that change? Over the years, I've taken care of you, loved you completely. Can any man do better than I have? If you leave me, you won't know how to adjust. You won't find a better husband than me. I've been so good to you. Can't you forgive me for this one mistake?" Zhao Liang claimed to love me, to have treated me so well. Yet he lived with another woman, had a child with her. How was that love? How was making me a clueless housewife love? Even now, he was justifying his betrayal. I used to believe that if there were two types of people in front of me, one with 100,000 who gave me all of it, and one with 1,000,000 who only gave me 100,000, I would always choose the first. Because sincerity mattered most. Zhao Liang was like that, but when I actually made the choice, I realized that when someone gives you everything, they also transfer all their expectations and burdens onto you. And when it's time to pay the price, it feels like you're being flayed alive. I couldn't say another word. The tears I had been holding in for over half a month finally broke free. Zhao Liang hugged me tightly, whispering in my ear, "Yuan Fei, my love, please don't make a scene. I really love you. I don't want to lose you. Can't you just pretend this never happened? I'll take care of everything." "How will you take care of it? The child is less than a year old." I pushed him away, feeling utterly drained. When had Zhao Liang become this kind of person? He tried to keep justifying himself, but I cut him off. The rest would be handled by the lawyers. I didn't want to see him again, or say another word. I had no intention of interfering with whatever happened between them. Su Wen was just as much a victim as I was. But I wasn't a saint. I couldn't just run up to her and say, "You've been fooled." If it weren't for Zhao Liang and the child, I think we could have become friends. I quickly had my lawyer draw up the divorce papers. Half of the company was built on my efforts, but I didn't want to keep it. From now on, I wanted a simple, comfortable life. Just enough money would do. I would leave the company to Zhao Liang. I didn't need the car he usually drove either. I would sell my shares at market value. And I didn't want the house we lived in. I would keep the two other properties. I had been more than fair. Splitting things down the middle was enough to end this nightmare. My lawyer told me I could push for more, given the clear evidence I had, but I was too tired for that. The feelings I'd invested over the years were real. The happiness I had was real. I didn't want to fight over assets and make things uglier than they needed to be. Besides, Zhao Liang hadn't transferred all the assets out of my name from the start. I figured he must have had some real feelings for me. The lawyer didn't press the issue and even complimented me for being so generous. What a joke. If I could, I would have slapped Zhao Liang hard across the face. The thought of him trying to manipulate me made my blood boil. I arranged to meet Zhao Liang on Monday at a cafe near his office in public. I knew he wouldn't dare make a scene. There was no longer any need for pleasantries between us. As soon as he arrived, I slid the divorce papers in front of him. "There's nothing to say. Just sign." Zhao Liang didn't even look at them. He tossed them aside and grabbed my hand just as he was about to speak. Something dramatic happened. Su Wen saw us. She approached with a confused expression. Before Zhao Liang could react, I yanked my hand away from his. Su Wen's sharp eyes caught sight of the divorce papers on the floor. My heart sank. Oh no, what now? I watched Su Wen's face change several times as she looked from me to Zhao Liang. "Zhao Liang, you bastard." She lunged at him, slapping him twice across the face, then hauled him up and punched him repeatedly. I stood there, frozen with Su Wen's fighting skills. I wouldn't be surprised if she were a boxing champion. The scene quickly descended into chaos, and someone called the police. The three of us were taken to the station. I never imagined I'd live to see the day I'd be invited for tea by the police after hearing our story. The police determined that Zhao Liang deserved the beating still. For the sake of fairness, they reminded Su Wen not to resort to violence in the future, and so, under the watchful eyes of the police and the other woman, Zhao Liang and I signed the divorce papers. The dramatic chapter of my life at 28 finally came to an end. Everything that happened afterward was told to me by Tiat Dongfeng. Who knew there'd even be after-sales service in a situation like this? Su Wen, true to her carefree nature, kicked Zhao Liang out of her life with a single blow and even took him to court. Zhao Liang was forced to pay a hefty settlement. His reputation and credibility in shambles, and his company started to crumble as a result. However, based on what I knew about Zhao Liang, I expected him to bounce back soon enough. The company had been his life's work, after all, but for some reason, Zhao Liang sold the company and moved back to the north. Tiat Dongfeng would occasionally text me, and I began to sense that he had feelings for me. But at this point in my life, all I wanted was to live on my own. "You're still too young, little brother, not my type. I plan on traveling the world, and who knows when we'll meet again." I shut down his hopes as gently as I could. After sending that message, I deleted his WeChat. I spent the last 6 months of my graduate program finishing my thesis and collaborating with my professor, running around from place to place. Slowly but surely, I found myself emerging from the shadow of my failed marriage. I'm grateful that throughout my time with Zhao Liang, I never lost sight of myself. I didn't turn into a full-time housewife who only knew how to indulge in leisure. I had my own passions and my academic pursuits in the beginning. I had wanted to share those accomplishments with him. I had envisioned us exploring this vast world together, but embarking on this great journey alone turned out to be just as fulfilling. My life was only a third of the way through. I wasn't about to let someone like him bring me down after completing my master's degree. I returned home and decided to tell my mother everything as expected. My mother scolded me, saying I didn't know how to judge people, accusing me of not listening to her advice then. With a sigh, she added that I had suffered, but at least there were no children involved. Starting over would be easier this way. I didn't agree with her criticisms. I didn't believe I had misjudged Zhao Liang. I still think. In the beginning, Zhao Liang was a good man, but people change. And I couldn't keep pretending not to notice his transformation just to maintain the facade of a happy marriage. These were things I couldn't explain to my mother. She wouldn't understand. And I wasn't interested in arguing about it. However, in my heart, I had already mapped out a new plan for the future. I wanted to study for my PhD abroad, travel the world, and live a free, adventurous life. As for love and marriage, I'd leave that for later.